Afternoon, good evening, wherever you're from. I hope that you're okay during this time of the pandemic. In this lesson, we will be having the behaviorist views of learning, which includes classical conditioning, connectionism, and operant conditioning. And this is your module 5A. So I have halved the behaviorist and the neo-behaviorist perspectives of learning. So hop on board and let's have the behaviorist views of learning. What is behaviorism? By the way, some of the slides are snipped out of the Google Slides, of course from Google. So there is no copyright infringement intended. This is just for pure academics. So what is behaviorism? Behaviorism is an attempt to make psychology more scientific by studying only external behaviors. Take note of this, external behavior. So we are not studying here internal, which includes the mind and the emotion. We are only studying here how we react externally to things. So what is behavior? Behaviorism came from the word behavior. What's behavior? Behavior is the response of an organism to stimuli, and the objective and the observable uh, reply to the objective and to what is observable. Example, you have been slapped on your face, on this side of the face. Your response, that is the stimulus, your response may be to slap the person who slapped you, or to let the person who slapped you slap your other side of the face. So whatever you do, that is your behavior. How you react, how you respond to a behavior, to a stimulus, is your behavior. Kaya minsan may sinasabi sila, sama ng ugali mo if you respond negatively. Pero ang ganda ng ugali mo if you respond um, the way the community or the society wants us to respond to situations. Let's continue. Behaviorism is the study of how environmental stimuli bring about changes in people's behaviors. Again, it is the study of how environmental stimuli bring about changes in people's behavior. Study of how we change, how we respond to how the community uh, provide situations for us to react to. Kung paano tayo mag-respond sa mga situations na nakikita natin sa paligid natin. That is behaviorism. Now, those who study behaviorism are called behaviorists. Now, the behaviorists ignore what goes in our mind, sabi ko nga kanina, since it cannot be measured and it cannot be seen. To them, mind is a black box. Further, according to behaviorists, we are born as blank slates, tabula rasa ni John Locke. One's environment writes on vessels to pour knowledge into. So according to John Locke, we are blank slates. We are in tabula rasa state. Our minds are blank, and as we go on living, we just learn. We accumulate knowledge, and then we are born as lumps of clay that can be shaped by one's environment. We go further into this when we see Watson's study. Ano pa? Behaviorists believe that environment, the extrinsic forces, is the only thing that matters. The only thing that matters. So, what is learning? Learning is the behavior change due to experience. So, you learn if you have changed your attitude or your behavior based on your experiences. That's why they say experience is the best teacher, because we learn more when we experience things. What else? Again, behaviorism does not consider or believe in intrinsic motivation or the motivation within. Now let's have the history of behaviorism. Where did behaviorism come from? Um, Behaviorism was introduced by Thorndike, um, with full name Edward Pavlov, I should say. Thorndike, Pavlov, um, John Watson are the ones who introduced behaviorism. Behaviorism was very popular in US before Piaget and Vygotsky's writing were translated and brought here. And when it was introduced in the US, ayan, behaviorism by a Thorndike beat out John Dewey's theories to become the dominant theory in the US. So before behaviorism, there was a theory in the US which is very, very dominant, which is John Dewey's theory, the pragmatism. Ano yung pragmatism? Pragmatism believes in um, experiencing things in order for us to learn things. Parang um, yung mga source ng on-the-job training. Ganyan. Pragmatics is defined as, uh, in language, telling the right thing at the right time to the right person. Um, or it can be a shortcut into um, practicality. Kung ano lang yung practical. So, that is the most dominant noon. That theory is very, very dominant noon sa US before behaviorism has been introduced, because they believe that we learn things when we experience it. So, when behaviorism was introduced, US schools were structured after behaviorism rather than Dewey's model. Americans were very interested in a scientific way to parent and to educators. Educators dapat yan. Let's go further for the history. The theory begins in US around 1910 with Edward Lee Thorndike. Edward Lee Thorndike. He experimented with cats and dogs in puzzle boxes, and this is an example. This is a puzzle box. So as you can see, the cat is caged in a box, and in order for him to get out, there is actually a plate of a plate of fish here outside the box, and in order for him to eat what is outside the box, he needs to pull push this lever in order for this pulley to pull the lock here. It was locked here. So if the cat will be able to push the lever, he will be able to get out and eventually eat the plate of fish. So in his experiment, he found that they learned through trial and error and not by observation. As you can see here, the cat does not observe anyone or anything. He just succeeds with the use of trial and error. This became very influential design in US schools. Now, we also have here another proponent, which is John Watson. John Watson said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own special world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to be any type of specialist I might select, a doctor, a lawyer, or an artist." He said this in 1924. Who is he? He is very much celebrated with his experiment with Albert. Albert is a child. What did he experiment with Albert? Watson applied classical conditioning in his experiment concerning Albert. Let me read to you this. A young child and a white rat. In the beginning, Albert was not afraid of the rat. So there was a rat, and Albert was not afraid of the rat. But Watson made a sudden loud noise each time Albert touched the rat. Because Albert was frightened by the loud noise, he soon became conditioned to fear and avoid the rat. So he was conditioned to avoid the rat because the rat is always accompanied by a loud noise, and Albert is afraid of the loud noise. Later, the child's response was generalized to to other small animals. So there was generalization. Whenever he sees small animals like the rat, example hamster or any smaller animals, he would be afraid of them. And then he was also afraid of, he became afraid of small animals. And then Watson then extinguished or made the child unlearn fear by showing the rat without the loud noise. So that was his famous experiment. He worked with Pavlov, the one of the proponents of classical conditioning. So that is behaviorism. There is a comic here which includes which pictures the experiment of Ivan Pavlov with dogs. The dog says, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book." So you see, the dog is experimenting back on Pavlov. Another here. Unbeknownst to most students, trivia ito, of psychology, Pavlov's first experiment was to ring a bell and cause his dog to attack Freud's cat. How did he do it? Let us see how he does this with his experiment. Now, this is his famous classical conditioning experiment, Pavlov. Before conditioning, this is the unconditioned stimulus. Yung stimulus is yung cause. Ano? This is the unconditioned stimulus. He presented a meat to an unconditioned response. Hindi na condition yung response niya. Automatic that if you present a meat to the dog, which is the dog's food, there is salivation. That is the unconditioned response. Now, we also have here neutral stimulus. When this bell is presented, if the bell is rung and the bell is rung to the dog, there is no response because it is not in any way affiliated or related to the dog. He cannot eat it, he cannot play it because it is very strange to him. Unlike the meat, it is his food. So there is an unconditioned response which is salivation. Naglalaway siya. Now let's see. Now during conditioning, this is the unconditioned stimulus is added to the neutral stimulus, meaning when the meat is presented, the bell is rung before it is presented to the dog, and it is repeated. When the meat is presented, the bell is rung. So, the dog produces unconditioned response, which is salivation. Salivation. Pag dalawa, pag nag-ring yung bell, the dog is conditioned na susunod ang meat. So, what is after conditioning? Oh, this is after conditioning. Kahit yung bell na lang yung maririnig na, the dog will salivate because he is already conditioned that every time the bell rings, there will come meat after. So, that is how he did his conditioning. Now, classical conditioning explains learning of involuntary emotional and or psychological responses. This happens when two stimuli are presented at the same time, or there is what we call contiguity. When two stimuli are presented contiguously, or there is contiguity, there is classical conditioning like that of the dog. The dog, he is conditioned to salivate with just the ringing of the bell. Like Albert. Albert in the beginning is not afraid of the rat. The experiment of Watson, can you remember? He is not afraid of the rat yet, but during conditioning, Watson presented the rat with a loud noise, which Albert fears. So when he sees rats, he is already afraid because he is already conditioned with the loud noise, which he fears. Hmm. Important for teachers since school can cause unintentional learning through classical conditioning, especially anxiety, test anxiety, general school anxiety, fear, frustration, humiliation. This is a very important um, theory for teachers because we can use this to condition our students. This goes with the thought of with the motto of teachers that teachers can make or break students depending on how we condition them, depending on what we tell our students. Uy, mahirap daw yung exam. Can condition the children to fear the exam because sinabi mong mahirap. But on the other hand, napakadali ng exam nyo. May condition the learners to feel at ease or to feel confident in taking the exam. Kasi yun yung sinasabi mo. That is why it is a reminder, this classical conditioning is a reminder for us to be very selective of our words. I just need to plug in because I am um, low battery. So with classical conditioning, I remember um, there is a cuento, there is a story I have read back in high school, and it is entitled Alang Dios. Alang Dios is a cuento of a tenant who killed his landlord. How? Uh, this tenant, we call him Tonyo. I do not remember the name. But this is an example of a classical conditioning. Tonyo's father has been killed, but they do not know who killed him. But Tonyo suspects that uh, I forgot the name of the landlord. Let's call him Don Tiburcio. Tonyo suspects that Don Tiburcio had his father killed. So he wants to take revenge, but he does not want to go to jail. So he planned another way of taking revenge, of avenging his father. So what did he do? Every morning, he clothed himself, he dressed himself like Don Tiburcio. Don Tiburcio is always wearing cowboy hat, leather jacket, and fitted pants with leather boots. So every morning he goes to the farm dressed as Don Tiburcio and would whip his carabao with latigo. Can you imagine the pain being whipped with latigo? Every morning he did that for 30 days. For 30 days. He whipped the poor carabao. And then he knows that after the month, Don Tiburcio would come and ask them their for their fee, for money, for their, how do you call it, their rent. So usually Don Tiburcio roams around the farm, and then one morning, as planned, Don Tiburcio went roaming around the farm, and when he is about to when he is about to touch to touch and pat the carabao, he suddenly swayed him to his death. Talagang binundol-bundol niya hanggang sinuway-suway niya hanggang nagkasugat-sugat and namatay si Don Julio. So, can Tonyo be sued for Don Tiburcio's death? No, because it was the Carabao who killed him. But of course, he is, but he only knows because he conditioned the Carabao to kill Don Tiburcio. So that's an example of classical conditioning. So we may make or break our students. We may brainwash them that they can do anything they want to do, or we can encourage them that they are poor and they do not know anything. So you choose. So what are the findings of Pavlov? First one, generalization. Generalization. When, for example, once the dog hears ringing, even though it is not from a bell, for example, ringing of phone, or the bell from the church, di ba? Mas malakas yung bell sa church kaysa sa small bell. He would generalize that he will be getting a piece of meat. So that is generalization. What else? There is extinction. When does extinction happens? Extinction happens when um, you present, for example, you present the bell without meat ng paulit-ulit, he will be reconditioned na wala na. That bell is bell alone. There will be no more meat. So there will be the knowledge that the bell comes with the meat will be extinct. So there is extinction. Nakuha nyo? 3. Spontaneous recovery. Ano ba yan? Spoon daw. Spontaneous recovery. For example, there is already an extinction. Nakalimutan na niya na paulit-ulit mong present sa kanya yung bell na wala ng meat. So nakalimutan na niya. And then, one time, you rang the bell again with meat. So naalala niya, ay, pag ringing ulit yung bell, pangalawa, pangatlong time, maalala niya na baka merong meat ulit. So that is spontaneous recovery. And then next, we have discrimination. Eventually kapag sanay na siyang naririnig yung bell, he will be discriminating. He will know the difference between the bell na ginagamit mo na may meat, yung bell ng phone, o yung bell ng kalembang sa may simbahan. So, he will know the discrimination. Parang tayo, nung mga bata tayo, we assume that when there are putok, akala natin gun lahat, sound of a gun lahat. But of course, today that we are already older, we know how to discriminate between the sound of a gun and the sound of a firework. Parang ganon. Next, higher order conditioning. So, one of his findings, higher order conditioning. Paano ito? Higher order conditioning happens when the dog is conditioned to other tasks. For example, may mga dog show where the dogs can count, the dogs can ride. Out of conditioning yung mga yon. Out of conditioning. Now, let's have Connectionism by Edward Lee Thorndike. Ano yung connectionism? According to connectionism, from the word connection, learning has taken place when a strong connection, a strong connection or bond between stimulus and response is formed. there is a very strong bond between stimulus and response. For example, for example, um, tingnan na lang natin yung mga laws. The laws derived from connectionism. For example, law of effect. Law of effect. Ano ba itong law of effect? The law of effect states that a connection between a stimulus and response is strengthened when the consequence is positive, and the connection between the stimulus and response is weakened when the consequence is negative. For example, um, the child drew a house kahit ang pangit-pangit para sa'yo. Pero sinabi mong, wow, ang ganda. So, the law of effect states that kapag ganon, he received a positive feedback, uulitin niya. So, the stimulus is praising the feed, and then the response is uulitin niya yon. However, kapag negative, ang pangit naman. So, hindi na niya uulitin. The response would be negative. So, the law of effect. Next, law of exercise. There is what we call practice makes perfect, and that goes with law of exercise. If one thing is practiced, inulit-ulit-ulit, pasasaan ba't ma-perfect din yan? So, the stimulus is practice, and then the response is perfection. Next, the law of readiness. Law of readiness. How do we do this? Stimulus here that we provide, or teachers and parents provide. For example, law of readiness in reading, or law of readiness in identifying yung mga early childhood learners. For example, identification of nose, identification of eyes, identification of ears, yung mga parts of the body. One stimulus or one practice for law of readiness is when we base them, di ba, kung pinapaligo natin sila, sabon sa ulo, tapos wash ang mata, touch ang ilong, mga ganyan, brush your teeth. Doon pa lang, they can already start to identify the parts of their body. Sabon ang arms, sabon ang hands, wash hands, mga ganyan. So, law of readiness. Next, law of recency. The law of recency states that the child remembers what is most recent. The learner remembers what is most recent. Parang yung Lasong syndrome, LSS. This goes with this law of recency. Paulit-ulit na yun yung nagre-ring sa tenga mo. Next, law of intensity. Kung ano yung pinaka-bad na memory na na-experience niya, yun yung laging naaalala niya. Or pinaka-best na naaalala niya. The most intense experience is what retains in the memory of the learner. And the law of primacy. The law of primacy is the reverse of the law of recency. The law of primacy states that the first lesson, or the first lessons are the ones retained in the learner. I still remember a poem that we have memorized back in grade 1. I don't know why. I can still remember up to now. We had this uso nun yung acrostic, and I had memorized letter A. Angel small or big, cloud of pink or white, singing on that very eve, rejoicing that grand birth. Pang Christmas yun. I don't know why I have memorized it up to now. Maybe because of this law of primacy. Yun yung talagang tumatak sa first poem na minemorize ko nung elementary, kaya siguro nandito pa. So that is law of primacy. So what are the principles? Connectionism principles derived. First, learning requires both practice and rewards. Of course, if you reward, if you reward uh, the positive, then the more that they will repeat the positive. If you practice, if you practice what is required, then the more that they may perfect what you want them to achieve. Next, a series of SR means stimulus response connections can be chained together if they belong to the same um, action sequence. What does that mean? In the law of readiness, so yun nga, sabi ko sa inyo kanina, if you chain together as early as possible, you are already chaining the stimulus in order for them to get ready to learning to the formal schooling. Another example is when you will you count your fingers? So yung mga yon, pasimple lang. Tapos sabi mo, wow, ang galing, makakakount na siya ng 1, 2, 3. So that is readying them to learning. Next, number 3, transfer of learning occurs because of previously encountered situation. So, transfer of learning occurs because of previously encountered situation. Again, this tells us that experience is the best teacher. And number 4, intelligence is a function of the number of connections learned. So, depending on how many connections did you get. Ganito pala yon. Yung mga, ano nga tawag sa accidental discovery, serendipity. The number, depending on the number of serendipity that you have. Serendipity is accidental discovery. Yung, ganito pala yun. Ganon. The number of that determines how intelligent a learner is. So, may I ask you, how intelligent are you? Next, we have the third and the last in behaviorist perspective, operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is introduced by Bruce Frederick Skinner, as in, wait, I'll write. Bruce, double R pala. This is supposed to be double R. Bruce Frederick Skinner. He is an American psychologist, very influential from the 30s to 60s. He developed operant conditioning. He is famous from Skinner box used with pigeons and rats. Medyo bilisan na lang natin. Skinner's operant conditioning believed that behavior is sustained only by reinforcement or punishment and not free will. The conditioning is voluntary and controllable behavior. Organisms tend to repeat actions that are reinforced. Ang bilis. Ito na. In operant conditioning, he believed with reinforcement and punishment. Ano yung reinforcement? Reinforcement can be of two things, positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Ano yung positive reinforcement? For example, the child drew a house and you told him, ang ganda. So there is the presence of pleasant stimulus. So the behavior increases. Magdo-drawing ulit siya ng mas maganda pa. Yung negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is the absence of unpleasant stimulus. For example, habang nagdo-drawing siya, pa-erase siya, so medyo madumi yung gawa niya, pero maganda pa rin. So sinabi mo na, ang ganda, pero mas maganda sana kung hindi ka nag-erase. So, still, there is increase of behavior. Magdo-drawing pa rin siya, and he will try to not erase this time. While punishment, there is presence of unpleasant stimulus or absence of pleasant stimulus. Yung punishment, may gusto kang i-check. So, ang gagawin mo, you provide punishment. Example, hindi siya gumawa. Sabihin mo, as a consequence, hindi ka gumawa. Excuse me. Wala kang grade. Punishment is the presence of unpleasant stimulus or absence of pleasant stimulus. Sorry for that, uminom lang ako. Where the behavior decreases. Ano yung pinapa-decrease natin? Yung ayaw nating behavior. For example, you punished a child because he did something. For example, nagmura siya. So, sabi mo, stand on the wall. So, pwedeng mag-decrease yung behavior niya. Pwede, kung gusto niya. So, anong operant conditioning? Teachers can deliberately use operant conditioning with their students in the form of training. They can use reward for good behavior or punishment for bad. Ano pa? How someone reacts to our behaviors determines whether or not we continue the behavior. How we react to a certain behavior of our students will determine whether they will continue that behavior or not. If we are reinforced for something, we will likely do it again. If we are punished for something, we will likely not do it again. So, the consequences of behaviors. Positive reinforcement. You behave in a way that results in a reward, so you are more likely to repeat that behavior. Yung positive reinforcement, sabi ko nga sa inyo kanina, praise mo na maganda, so pwedeng the more likely that they will repeat the behavior. Yung negative reinforcement, you behave in a way that results in the removal of something unpleasant. For example, na late niyang sinabit yung papel niya, kaya sabi mo, next time ayoko nang makitang late yung papel mo. So, there is a tendency, the more likely that they will pass their paper on time. In both cases, something happened that you saw as good, and as a result, you exhibited the behavior more. While for punishment, the consequence that follows a behavior resulting in you exhibiting the behavior less often in the future. Example of this, paying a fine kasi hindi siya nag-uniform kahit alam niyo yung rule. Ano pa? Staying after school kasi ayaw niyo makikooperate. Ayan. Removing something you like. For example, grounded ka, wala kang cellphone. Ganyan. Those are punishment. In both cases, yung punishment, you see it as bad. Yung reinforcement, you see it as good. Now, is negative reinforcement the same as punishment? O, tingnan natin ha. Negative reinforcement, something unpleasant is removed. And as a result, you're more likely to do it again. You see this as good. Maganda siya. Kasi, nag-improve ka pa. Yung punishment, consequence siya ng hindi ka aya-ayang ginawa mo. Kaya, as a result, you are punished and you see it as bad. So, back to the question, is negative reinforcement the same as punishment? No. Now, let's contrast classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is, in classical conditioning, the response is involuntary. Like when you present the meat to the dog, involuntary, the dog salivates. While in classical conditioning, when the two stimuli are paired, which elicits response, the response is voluntary. In operant conditioning, the response is voluntary. Ano ba yun sa iba yung binabasa ko. In classical conditioning, two stimuli are paired. For example, the bell and the meat. In operant conditioning, the stimulus comes after the response. Okay. So, what is the relationship between behaviorism and education? Behaviorism in education is focused only on external rather than internal motivation. So, kung ano lang yung nakikita niya, ginagawa ko to kasi na-praise ako, or ginagawa ko to kasi may premyo. Okay? And then, it views incremental learning. There is an incremental view of learning. Ano yon? Paano yon? Step by step. Parang yung pag-train ng aso. Ngayon, ititrain kita na kumahol kapag tinap ko itong, for example, tinap ko ng 3 times yung door, bar, ganyan. Incremental, step by step. And then it is focused on the individual rather than social. It doesn't focus on social learning. It focuses on the individual learning. And motivation and behaviorism, of course, again, I repeat, motivation is external only. And we do things to avoid being punished and or to earn praise. Now, for your task, write your answer on a whole sheet of pad paper. In your own words, differentiate operant from classical conditioning. Number 2, do you prescribe adapting behaviorism theory in learning? Why or why not? And number 3, recall situations where operant, classical, and connectionism theories are applied. Give one each. And one question that would test whether you have really studied this video or not. Write, for number 4, write the story that I have told you as an example of classical conditioning, the story of the tenant and the landlord. So with this, I hope you learned something. If not, comment down your questions and or PM me and we will talk. God bless.